Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Lisa Bachman, and I'm the Executive Director at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center, and this is part of the programming that we do to help educate our community about the history and lessons of the Holocaust. Tonight, I have an incredible pleasure of introducing to you Carrie Madden Lunsford, who is the author of 9 books for children and adults. Her book, Up Close Harper Lee, made Booklist's top 10 biographies of 2009 for youth. Her newest picture book is Ernestine's Milky Way, which was published by Penguin Random House Schwartz Wade in 2019. And her middle grade novel, Werewolf Hamlet, is forthcoming with Charles Bridge Publishing in 2025, so be on the lookout for that. Carrie is a regular contributor to the LA Times op-ed page and a professor of creative writing right here at UAB in Birmingham. So please welcome Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you.
And our special guest, Menachem Kaiser, is a writer currently living in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in Toronto, Canada. He has a BA from Columbia University and an MFA from the University of Michigan. I won't hold that against you. And he was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, Bomb, Vogue, and many other places as well. And I don't know if many of you had seen it recently. He had an op-ed in the New York Times that I found incredibly fascinating, talking about Nazi artifacts and the people purchasing them. It was called What Kind of a Person Has a Closet Full of Nazi Memorabilia? And it was a very, very interesting perspective, talking about how we need to really understand that not everybody who purchases Nazi memorabilia is a Nazi, and that there is historical value in stories to be told. And speaking of stories to be told, I'm going to turn it over. Carrie and Menachem are going to have a conversation, and then Mike and I will be around with a mic so that you can ask your questions before we wrap up the program. Please welcome Menachem and Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, it's great to be here. I'd like to thank the Alabama Holocaust Education Center too. So I found this quote from the Los Angeles Review of Books by Namit Sturm Nagel, and it says, "Treasure is ostensibly at the core of this soul-searching memoir, both Kaiser's quest for the treasure that is his grandfather's property in Poland and the Nazi loot the Silesian treasure hunters spend their lives dedicated to chasing, serendipitously using a memoir by Kaiser's cousin as a map. And yet mostly it feels like the readers need to keep digging as they read, because Kaiser points out that the true spoils of the memoir are the story itself and how it might help shape him and us. Reading each section of the book is akin to unwrapping a new layer of a Russian nesting doll. As soon as you think you have reached the core of the narrative, you discover that there is another layer to break open." I thought that just captured it so beautifully. So I wondered if you could just start by telling us the journey of how you became, I know you were getting your MFA at the University of Michigan, you were in fiction, and was writing a memoir, and all. Just begin with the journey, and let's just start there.
There's actually a little bit of a prologue that's not in the book, like a little bit of a fun little tidbit. You know, I lived in Lithuania. I was doing sort of unrelated research from 2010 to 2011, and then I bumped into a Hasidic Jew in January in Lithuania. And you know, from New York, which is, you don't meet many Americans in January in Lithuania. You certainly don't meet Hasidic Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And he had like a Bob Marley shirt in Hebrew, smoking weed. It was like a pro-weed Bob Marley shirt, Hasidic shirt, and I was like, what are you doing here? And so we became friends. It's a long story that involves falafel. So whatever. And he turned out to be the road manager for the German band, the Scorpions. So
wow, yeah.
Like a hurricane. And so I helped the Scorpions out. I actually took the Scorpions to karaoke.
Oh my God.
This is my biggest fame where I begged them to sing their own song, but they did not. And anyway, so that guy turned out to be, his father was the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that does not exist anymore, and yet it has a chief rabbi. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm not going to repeat everything I just said. Oh, still.
You can.
There's the non button? I don't know where the non button is. Okay. I found it. I figured it out.
Okay.
I'm my own tech guy.
Oh, tell them.
So anyway, and, he actually invited me to come to Poland for the first time. And so when I went to Poland for the first time, I had no sense of my own family history. I really wasn't searching. I went because he said it would be fun.
Right.
And it was. And I sort of actually fell in love with Poland that first time I went. And I started going very frequently from 2011. And then in 2015, that first time I went to visit my grandfather's building, where I believed at the time he had grown up. And that was my first sort of, I met the building. I didn't know my grandfather growing up. I had no sense of him. Excuse me. And I really, to be totally frank, I really wasn't that curious or interested. And I sort of crossed it off the list. It was a kind of out of a sense of etiquette.
Right.
Like, I went to my grandfather's hometown, I saw where he was from, and that I didn't have any reason to believe I would ever go back or the story would continue. And then in 2015, I began to take very small steps towards reclaiming that property. I met another Hasid who introduced a lawyer to me. And so I began the reclamation process because I thought it would be kind of a fascinating entry into questions I was really interested in that had to do with memory and politics, and history and personal history. And then a year later, and this is kind of a confusing story and a long story, I encourage you to read the book, I became a celebrity among Silesian treasure hunters. And so at that point, I was like, this story is weird enough for a book.
Yes.
And so I was kind of bummed about it, because that meant I would have to at least try and write it.
Right.
And it's the most unpleasant experience in the world, as you can relate 9 times.
Yes.
And so that's really sort of the starting point of the book.
Right. So I'm thinking about your grandfather's building, and you have this great way of describing, going in soft and and you wrestle with your own, just that. What's the right thing to do? How do I do it? And so I just wonder if you could talk about that process. Yeah.
Sure. When I began the reclamation process, I really came from a point of, I sort of inherited a narrative about what that property was. And it, again, in an abstract way, because it wasn't something I grew up really knowing all that about. But when I began the reclamation process, I would say the default narrative was, this was my grandfather's building. And it belonged to him, and now it rightfully belongs to us.
Yes.
And I'm just sort of picking up where he left off. Again, a detail is I found out, I didn't know my grandfather, but I found out only after spending time in Poland that my grandfather had tried and failed for almost 40 years to reclaim the property. So I sort of inherited his failure and saw, can I rectify it in some way, or even continue his failure? I was interested even if I would fail.
Right.
And so, but the narrative I did was more one of a continuous Jewish narrative. And then while I was doing this process, I encountered quite a bit of pushback from my friends in Poland and even from my friends here, who kind of forced me to look at it a little bit different, to sort of at least reckon with the people who still lived there.
Right.
And I'm ashamed to say that it didn't really enter my head before. And it's sort of like there was a kind of an act of moral cowardice that I wasn't reckoning with that question before. And so I said that the least I can do is sort of force myself to confront their story at the very least. So I went in, I'm ashamed to say at the beginning I sort of pretended, I wasn't brave enough to say, I'm in this property, I'm in the process of reclaiming the property. I thought that would sort of invite too much confrontation, and I'm Canadian. And so I don't really seek out conflict like that. But eventually, the first person I met was so unbelievably open and open-hearted.
Yeah.
Within 20 minutes of meeting him, he told me the story of meeting his mother for the first time at the age of 40. And so it was just a remarkable story and just remarkably open to me. And at that point, the gig was up, and I was like, I can't lie to this man, even by omission. So I told him the whole story, and I actually, I really sort of fell in love with the building itself. And it sort of had a remarkable story in its own right. It had all, during communist time, it had all been dedicated to the theater.
All the theater people.
Everyone in the building was associated with like a renowned provincial theater. So there was the director, or the costume guy, or the secretary, or the actors. And even today, everyone was like descendants or actually still some of those original people of the theater. Now, spoiler alert, it was the wrong building. But that doesn't mean I didn't have like a really special relationship with it. And so this was part of like I found this sort of these moral and ethical questions very, very challenging and very, very tricky.
Yeah.
And so I sought to like, at the best of my ability, to at least try and navigate them. I don't have easy answers to them, but to avoid them entirely would have been even a bigger act of moral cowardice than which I went in.
Right. No, and we really got to, you showed us the people. We really got to know Hannah. We got to know all the characters in the building. So I just thought they became real people. They were. So I want to know, working in the realm of memoir, how did this reveal rifts and reactions in the family? I mean, the scene with your father, when you have a scene where you described like the home movies in the basement, which we have a set of those, and so I just thought, and then getting them, and the way you described it as almost time travel, seeing these beautiful films. So
you're saying the fact that I wrote a memoir that involves my family,
yeah.
You know, it's one of we mentioned it, earlier today. It's one of the fascinating things is you write this memoir and you spend so much time with sort of like, let's call them the literary counterparts to these people.
Yeah.
Like they're those real people and they exist in the page, and there's a little bit of a gap. And I was so nervous.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I could never have predicted in a million years what people were upset about.
Yeah.
It was completely shocking. And so for context, a very important context, and this question specifically is I grew up in an Orthodox home, very, very observant, and so my immediate family is very Orthodox, and my extended family is very Orthodox. And so that was a live wire.
Yeah.
So any sort of reflection on my own observance or lack thereof was going to be a very touchy subject, so I sought to minimize it. And so there is, within the book, there's a scene where my father and I have a confrontation where my father sort of confronts me that he's like, oh, you're so obsessed with your grandfather's legacy, i.e. the building, but you're ignoring the kind of legacy that he would have cared about, i.e. religion. And I found that to be a very, very challenging point. It took me quite a while to sort of appreciate what he was saying on his own terms, rather than undermining what I saw as not necessarily important work, but a highly personal work. But I did. And so I was terrified of that scene. My father responded wonderfully. The scene he was very sort of torn up about was actually when I got drunk with there's a scene where I get drunk with the treasure hunters at night. I get sort of like, the word that's in my head, probably shouldn't say out loud, but like I got blasted. I don't know, what's the Alabama word for very, very drunk? There's no good, like, what is it?
Wasted.
Oh, okay. I was hoping for like a good local vernacular. I got really those things with these treasure hunters, and my father and I never thought he would care about that part, but he actually felt in a way that I found very sweet. He felt protective of me.
Oh yeah.
He said, I feel my job here is to sort of, in a way, protect you from yourself. It was very paternalistic in a loving way. He said, you're representing yourself in a way that I don't think you'll be able to undo. And like, I don't care. I don't care that people saw that I got drunk, but I appreciated it. Like, it wasn't coming from a religious place. It was coming from sort of a just protective place, which I thought, well. And then, this is a long story, but I got in a crazy fight with my aunt about whether or not my grandmother's sofa had a plastic cover. Just, you could not believe. Both of us spent months doing research, like picking up old family videos and finding evidence on my side. And interestingly, it's inconclusive.
How's it inconclusive? Really?
It's so complicated. This became the most fun part for me. So that was a big fight right before the book came out, whether to include this line. And I took it out. But I did write a big essay about it, so I got the last laugh. So that was a big fight. And and at the end of the day, just the sweet part of it was, my family is a very, very unsentimental family.
Right.
And so, all of us grew up with this idea that our grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but none of us, we never knew anything about it. It was completely blank history.
Right.
And we sort of knew it, but we weren't challenged by it or really all that curious. But to put that into context, also, I want to say that everyone we knew was like that. We didn't feel there was any sort of sense of responsibility or that we were very special. I would say 90% of the kids I knew growing up, everyone
Right.
was Orthodox, and almost all of them had at least one, if not 3 or 4 grandparents who were Holocaust survivors.
Right.
But this, at the end of the day, the most meaningful and personal sort of value of this book is as a gift to my family.
Yeah.
And so I was
Yeah.
like, while the story was going on, I'd come back every few minutes and be like, you'll never guess what happened. And they'll be like, we don't understand what you're talking about. What are those tunnels? Who are these treasure hunters? Who's Abraham? All these things. And then I was able to give them this book. And now some read it and some didn't. But that's not my problem. I gave them the gift. And,
Yeah.
In a way, it's opened and in a way kind of closed the chapter on
Yeah.
our family history.
Yeah.
So there's that.
That's great. So let's talk about Poland. And so we get lots of different Polands. We get the people fascinated by Nazism and the treasure hunters, and we get the Law and Justice Party and the kind of Kafkaesque court system, and then we get contemporary Polish politics, and then we get the people who take the pilgrimage. I'm thinking like Steve and the others. And what they're actually seeing and coming for. So could you elaborate on the different Polands you encountered?
I love that question. Yeah,
Okay.
so, right, because I spent a lot of time in Poland, and, one of the big, not regrets exactly, but it didn't fit into the book, actually, my contemporary experience of Poland,
Yeah.
as weird as it sounds.
Yeah.
I would go, and I found Poland to be sort of the most invigorating, stimulating place for someone who's sort of dealing with questions on an artistic or scholarly level about Jewish identity. Very challenging, very interesting, a tremendous amount of non-Jewish energy is invested in these questions, which I really took from and sort of collaborated with and pushed back on, and they pushed on me. It is the most bizarre place in the world in terms of like Jewish community.
Right.
Unbelievably strange and kind of scandalous. I mean, I could not even begin to tell you some of the weird scandals. Everything from wife poisonings.
Oh my God.
I know. It's strange. Everyone's okay.
Yeah.
But someone did poison their wife. And to like a multi-million-dollar like tax scandal. And so I was not able to capture that weirdness in the book. It was just way, way outside the scope. But the Polands I did deal with were sort of like this Silesia, which was a place of mystery, which is their term. And this is treasure hunters. And the treasure hunter is a little bit of like a misnomer. So they're after treasure, but really what they're interested in mystery. And the way they use the term would be sort of unanswered questions. So there'd be like, what was this field? What was this infrastructure? What happened here? They're looking to sort of fill those gaps. And some of them get very creative and conspiratorial. But some of them are, I would say, real amateur or even not so amateur historians.
Right.
And so that sort of mystery I went deeper and deeper in, especially when I found that personal connection.
Yeah.
And then, for many years I would go to Poland as, let's say, a privileged tourist. And like I didn't have to touch the political questions. And when I began going from 2011 to 2015, everything felt on the ascent.
Yeah.
The food got better, the art got better. People had been traveling more. It was sort of the darling of the EU. And in 2015, there was an earthquake, a political earthquake, when the Law and Justice Party got elected.
Right.
And that was a huge turnaround. So all of a sudden, and the Law and Justice Party was a hyper-nationalist, revisionist, very religious party. And it's not quite accurate to call them anti-Semitic in any way, but it is right to call them a nationalist government that is fiddling with or flirting with revisionist histories.
Right.
And so stuff like museum funding got very iffy, or stuff like art funding, or who the director of a museum would be. And it's a place where Poland, in my experience, is a place where like the historical narrative is of such outsized significance. And so you'll have magazines about you'll have multiple magazines about World War II.
Right.
And so like the fight over the narrative of World War II is one that is being waged all the time. And so that one was like it was an earthquake. So my friends who, most of them grew up in the late 80s or early 90s, had no memory of communist Poland. And for them, this was the first time that it felt like there was a step backwards.
Right.
And so, and all of a sudden, I was in court, though. I was in court about this property, and their first move of the Law and Justice Party was a very ambitious judicial overhaul. So all of a sudden, the judges all came into question. And so I did now touch these questions in a way that I was like, I can no longer just be an ignorant tourist.
Right.
And the most challenging research I had to do was trying to understand the Polish courts,
Oh my
which was hard.
Yeah.
It was very hard. But yeah, so I had to sort of grapple with that Poland as well.
Right. Well, talk about the killer. Let's just talk a little bit about, for those of you.
Yeah, the killer is everyone's favorite character.
Yeah, we love the
Maybe
killer.
not the killer's favorite character. Anyways, when I began this process of reclamation, I needed a lawyer. And so I asked a Hassid, because I didn't know who else to ask. I was like, do you know a lawyer? And he's like, he was a Hassid from Brooklyn too. He's like, you gotta go with the killer. And I was like, why? And her name is the killer because her last name is Kilar. And so they called her the killer. And the killer was like somewhere between 80 and 130 years old. And so the first time I met her, it was like this little office right in like a north neighborhood in Krakow. And I went in and it was like the killer and her two daughters who are like, I think paralegals. There's everything was cats. There was no actual cats, but the theme was cats. So there was like cat calendars, cat like videos. One of the daughters was watching a video of pandas.
Right.
And like I would go into their car. It was full of like picture books of cats. They'd give me my legal documents in cat folders. They don't live together,
Right.
but they live like next to each other. And one point, there's no husbands or no men, or I don't know if there's any other kids. I don't think so. They own something like 27 cats collectively.
Oh my God.
I'm like, these are my people. And so they're actually good lawyers, I think.
Right.
And but they're very old school. But I was dealing in like a smaller town. And so at one point I did have to hire another lawyer
Right.
to explain my lawyer to me.
Right, right.
So I had to hire like a lawyer consultant. But the killer was amazing. She came up and she would wear this amazing velour like tracksuits
Right.
to court and then put the robe on over. And I like her a lot, but I didn't use her real, she's only known as the killer. And so
Right.
she is for sure the character people are most curious about.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
I didn't see coming. But.
No, she's and the whole setup was just
Yeah.
great. So let's talk about Abraham Kaiser. Maybe we can look at some of the slides too. But I think, why do you think? I mean, first of all, let's talk about just who Abraham Kaiser is. And one of my questions is like the lineage, and why do you think that was so important that you be his grandson? And
so let me introduce
Yeah,
treasure.
let's
I
do
think
that.
the people who haven't read the book, I've been saying things about treasure hunters, and it's very weird and confusing. And so I'm going to make it even more weird, but hopefully less confusing. So in 2015, I don't know if people remember, there was a story about the Golden Train. Did people recall anything
Remember
about
that?
it? Oh, okay, there. It was international news for a couple of weeks where these two so-called Polish treasure hunters announced to the world that they found something called the Golden Train. And the Golden Train is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that was loaded up in Wrocław, which was then Breslau, part of Germany. According to legend, was sent towards Berlin. For some odd reason, it got diverted and was parked underneath a mountain outside of a town called Wałbrzych. This was a legend sort of that began immediately after the war, and for decades, treasure hunters were looking for it.
Yeah.
And in 2015, two of them said they found it. And so the world, for really interesting reasons, believed them. And I heard that story at the same time. And at that time, I'd been spending 5-6 years going to Poland, and I was really sort of taken aback, because my time in Poland was full of like, it was a little bit more morose and let's say a grayscale. This was like gold and mysterious trains and underground tunnels. And so for reasons completely unrelated to my book, I at the time I was actually working on a novel. I went to grad school for fiction writing. I was working on a novel that is set in Poland, and one of my set pieces, I was like, this seems like an amazing set piece, this gold train. And so I reached out to this woman named Joanna Lamparska, who is like the authority. They call her the queen of the treasure hunters, and she's like a journalist. And she agreed to take me around. And at that time, it was strictly for like novel research. And so she did more than, she was really interested. She showed me these sites, Project Reason, we'll talk about those in a second. But she sort of introduced me to the culture of treasure hunters. And I mentioned them before, and there's a very, very large subculture between 100 and 200,000 people who sort of identify with this group. And this goes from anything to guys who go around with like metal detectors on the weekend to very sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups that use very high-end equipment like LiDAR or radar or drones or their own like digging machines. And they are looking for treasure for sure, but they also are, again, they're looking for answers. And they're very interested in Nazi infrastructure, the terrain, old abandoned mines, stuff like that. And so there's this culture of mystery. And at the center of this culture of mystery is something called Project Riza. And Project Riza are these 7 underground tunnels, but tunnels is a little bit of a misnomer. I would say they're structures because none of them are completed, but the ones closest to completion are sort of staggering in size. We're talking square miles. We're talking like ceilings 60, 70 feet high, hallways that could be a few hundred feet long. They're basically underground neighborhoods, and so with like multi-stories. And what's very sort of enigmatic about Riza is that there is virtually no primary documentation as to what they were used for, as what they were meant to be. And so we have basically 0 German documents as to what they were planning to do with them. So around these tunnels and around that whole site has sort of grown a very bizarre culture of like what these things were. So you have a lot of conspiracy theories like anti-gravity, that the Nazis were developing anti-gravity or time travel to nuclear factories or stuff like that. And so I was very, very fascinated on this trip. I was learning all that then.
Yeah.
And so Joanna, on this trip, she introduced me to 2 of these treasure hunters, this guy Andrzej and his sidekick Janek, who are really nice guys, but very macho, like very like, they're sort of Polish, they come from a small town, big ruddy guys with like fabulous mustaches, lots of camouflage and like cool digging toys and all sorts of, and they're cool old Land Rovers.
Right.
Very, very macho. And so they were sort of my guides to these tunnels. And so I went, it was sort of a mind-blowing experience. It's very strange. You had to go through water, wear overalls and big boots, and it's very, very dark. And so it's a very unusual, very compelling experience. And afterwards, we went and got a beer. And so we were just hanging around. I was asking all these sort of softball questions. Because again, I wasn't thinking I was writing about them.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, what do you guys do for work? What is the cool stuff you found? Blah, blah, blah. But I had brought a friend with me, another writer named Maya, and she has a lot more chutzpah than I do. She's not Canadian, so she's a lot more, she's much more into confrontation, and she asked a much tougher question. She said, what about the fact that, 14,000 Jews died while digging these tunnels?
Right.
And she wasn't asking to like undermine them in any way. She was saying, how do you sort of integrate that with your experience of these sites? Are these sites a site of adventure or a site of death?
Yeah.
That was a basic question. And they got really sort of animated and worked up. And Andrzej started speaking very, very quickly in Polish, which I do not speak. And so way too quick for Joanna to translate for me. And so I've been in this position many, many times. So basically what you do is you let them have the conversation, you lean back, and you wait for it to be summarized.
Right.
You get the bullet points. But all of a sudden, while they're speaking Polish, I started hearing my last name. And they don't know my last name, so they weren't speaking about me. So they started saying Kaiser, and I was like, what? And then you ignore it, but they said it again and again and again. And I finally interrupted. I said, who are you talking about? And Andrzej said, Menachem Kaiser. And they were shocked that I didn't know who he was, but he explained that Menachem Kaiser was a slave laborer in these tunnels. And he wrote, and the quote he said, Menachem Kaiser was one of the most important people to come out of the war, Jew or Pole. And that is not a sentiment you hear often from a Polish person living outside of the big city. And he explained that Abraham had written a memoir, and I later found out the story of the memoir is really, really compelling. Abraham had actually written his notes on stolen scraps of cement packaging and hid them from the camps before he'd get transferred. And after the war, he'd go from camp to camp retrieving these scraps. He took the scraps to a Polish editor, and in the early 60s, it was released as sort of like his memoir of his time there. And because, as I mentioned, there was no documentation as to what these tunnels were, Abraham's memoir had become a sort of the only primary document. I would subsequently come to meet treasure hunters who've read it 40 times and who followed his pilgrimage, and he has become like a mythical figure among the treasure hunting community. So he's, all this I'm learning while we're having a beer. And I'm like, so weird, because my last name is Kaiser. And they're like, wow, what do you, maybe he's related. I was like, where's he from? And they said he's from Łódź.
Right.
Now, Łódź is on the other side of the country from where
Yeah.
my family's from. I was like, I guess not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next day, I went to one of the larger tunnels, one that's sort of built up and is a tourist attraction.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a gift shop. And at the gift shop, they were selling books. And one of the books was Abraham Kaiser's book.
Right.
And so it's called Zarzutami Śmierci. I'm mispronouncing it, but it means Behind the Wires of Death. So I bought the book. I couldn't read it, but I thought, what a funny and interesting memento. to
Yeah,
have.
yeah.
And that night, I was in my apartment in Wrocław, and I was bored, and I just opened it up, and there was a preface written by the museum staff.
Mm-hmm.
And the first line, even though it was in Polish, I could understand that he was not born in Łódź, he was born in Będzin. And Będzin is the town, the adjoining town to where my family's from. So I was like, okay, this changes the nature of the coincidence. And so I scanned the text with my phone and put it through an online translator. And I could see they wrote out who Abraham's parents were and who his siblings were. And with that information, I went back to the documents my lawyer had provided in order to fill out our family tree. And for the first time, I made a family tree. And I saw that not only were Abraham and my grandfather related, he was in fact my grandfather's closest surviving relative.
Yeah.
He was my grandfather's first cousin. And now, depending on your families, maybe first cousin is not that big of a deal, but in my grandfather's family, where we were under the impression his siblings had been murdered, his parents had been murdered, his aunts, uncles had been murdered, we were under the impression that all of his family, all of his first cousins had been murdered. And so in that moment, my family went from extinct to not extinct.
Yeah.
And so this was a very, very close, sort of like a very shaped, like a life-altering
Yeah.
connection. And then as soon as the treasure hunters heard I was Abraham Kaiser's grandson, even though I was not his grandson, that's the story they went with and
Yeah.
insisted on, then I became a celebrity for
Right.
the next few years, and I hung out with them a lot.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the two twin narratives of the book are sort of my descent into the treasure hunting subculture and my attempts to reclaim the property.
Right, right. Yeah, I love the story of just when you were drinking with the treasure hunters, you ended up, and I will say, you had to pour out you had to pour it out on the ground.
They could drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, they could really drink.
So your memoir, a lot of this, it reads like a documentary film would be structured. And it's so beautifully cinematic, full of suspense, and you were clearly open to serendipity. And so did you have encounters that didn't make it into the narrative? Were there encounters that were...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. You know, what's a fun one? A really fun one that was like very, very fun and interesting, but like didn't do anything for the narrative was I
Yeah.
went to the convention. I went for a couple of years to they call it the Mystery Festival.
Right.
And it's in sort of a it's called Książ Castle, which is it's a castle in like the storybook sense. It's just an enormous castle. Every year, Joanna runs a festival of mystery. So the treasure hunters go, it's sort of the who's who of the treasure hunters world.
Right.
But there's ghosts and a lot of drinking, and we got into some big fights. I gave talks about my work. So that was there was reenactments, some guys selling castles. You can buy a castle for very cheap. If anyone wants to buy a castle in Western Poland, we're talking like $50,000. You get your own castle.
Right.
But you're not allowed to do any renovations.
Right.
So yeah, lots of fun
Yeah.
stuff in there.
That's great. So maybe we could look at some of the slides,
yeah.
because I just thought that should be, just since we're on.
I don't really know how to
Oh
work
yeah, here, okay. So what do we have here?
So this is a map of, on the left you see a map of where the Riza sites are,
Right.
but these also include like the campsites. But basically you could see it surrounds a mountain. And so they were basically trying to hollow out a mountain.
Okay.
And on the left, you have the floor plan for one of the largest in square footage. And so this doesn't give you a sense of how big it is, but it's like those corridors are like giant corridors. You can see how big the grid is. This is not even complete because a lot of it has not been excavated. And so Vodash it's run by kind of an unhinged man who runs it like his little personal fiefdom.
Right.
He somehow leased it. And so it's like a military theme park.
Right.
It's very distasteful.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, he actually built a golden train.
Oh,
Yeah.
he built one for.
It was completely shocking. He put a train inside the tunnel, and he put like giant gold swastikas on it and called it Złoty Pociąg, the golden train, as a tourist attraction. And he really thought it was an educational experience, but it would be like you run the train, and I don't think it ever was operational. I think it was like too much even for him. And you would see like mannequins in in striped pajamas with like mannequins in SS outfits. It was so weird and distasteful.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's crazy.
And then we'll look at
So these are sites from Asufka, which is one of the larger ones. And so like you can't really get scale from the one on the left. That ceiling is at least 60 feet tall. And so, that's the thing. You hear these stories of the Golden Train, you're like, what a crazy myth, so weird. And then you visit these places and you're like, it really sort of breaks your imagination because, a train could fit in here.
Yeah.
And that's also another one. And they did a really good job with the lighting. And so from where the photographer is standing until that little yellow dot is at least 250 feet. I mean, these things are massive, massive. This is probably like a 20 feet tall. So just to give you a sense of the scale, it's really, really big.
Right.
And so let me start, the one on the right, so only like 10% of the tunnels are finished with reinforced concrete. And so you could get a little bit of it's sort of like a James Bond supervillain layer. They're very weird aesthetically. And then the one on the left, that was the first one I went to. That's actually from the first time I went. It's called Sobon. It's one of the smallest, and so it's not open to the public. You have to just know where it is using GPS coordinates, and it's to get in. It's sort of like the hole is like this big, so you have to sort of get on your back and wiggle in. It's flooded with water. Those wooden A-frames are from the war, and I would pretty easily the darkest place I've ever been in my life.
Yeah.
That photo was only possible with a very, very expensive Leica with put it on a tripod with like a 2-second exposure. It's very, very dark. And so, yeah, that's from the first time we went in. Those are those two sites.
Let's see what we have.
And that one's also from Sabon towards the end. And when you get to the end, because there's sort of just a wall, again, this is a thing that's not open to the public. You need GPS coordinates. We found people's business cards. Like people advertising their like eco lodge, they call them, which I thought was an amazing advertisement. And then, that's another one. I think that's from Vodash. I don't know.
And are these all in Owl Mountain? Are they all part of?
These are all part of the Riza sites.
All part of the Riza
so
sites.
all sort of surround Owl Mountain.
Okay. I think
And the
that's
slideshow.
Yeah, that's it. Okay,
Yeah.
so we can leave them. Okay. All right. So Abraham, would you ever consider? Did you ever think of writing his story separately as a love story? I mean, that was just the story of Gertrude, and I mean, just how he is. If you want to tell a little bit about.
Sure. So one of the sort of great surprises of writing this book, was finding out more about Abraham after the war. So we always had a gap because, I knew Abraham immigrated to Israel in 47, 48, but I could not figure out what happened between 1945 and whenever he left. And, in his memoir, he writes about how he was saved by a woman. He doesn't mention her name.
Yeah.
By a German. He escaped from the camp a few weeks before the war was over, and he runs down. This is all in his book. He runs down and he meets a woman in the alley, and he begs her to save him. And she puts him in like a box of potatoes, and he sort of lives there for a month. And then a Russian soldier opens it up and says, "You're free," and he goes outside, and that's the end of the book. But I never had more information than that.
Right.
And then through just a wild series of coincidences, I ended up finding the children of the woman who saved him. And her name was Gertrude Froelich, and the children were still alive, and the children remembered Abraham from 1945.
Wow.
And Gertrude and Abraham actually became lovers. They had a relationship, and that's why he stayed. And the children regarded him as a father figure. And I remember I showed them the picture of Abraham, of one of the women, Hilda, and she looked at it and just addressed the photo. She said, "Why did you leave us?" Oh. And it was just like a remarkable and sort of compelling love story. And later, Gertrude, it's just a crazy story, a crazy coincidence, but Gertrude was awarded the Yad Vashem, Righteous Among the Gentiles, in 1999, about 6 weeks before she died. And she never actually knew what happened to Abraham. And so eventually, when the war came, the Germans were expelled from that region. And so Gertrude, what the children told me was Gertrude wanted Abraham to come.
Right.
But Abraham, I guess, could not stomach going to Germany.
Yeah.
And Abraham wanted her, with her 4 children, to come to Israel. But she wasn't ready to go to Israel. And so it was sort of this, they were, I guess, torn apart again.
Yeah.
But it was just sort of a remarkable story to encounter. And so, yeah, it was one of the biggest treats, you'd say, of like writing this book, was sort of encountering this story.
Yeah. You write, let our stories leak, become diffuse and imprecise. And we have students here tonight who are writing memoirs and writing stories. Do you have any advice for them? And I know
Don't do it. Do I have advice for writing memoirs?
Yeah.
The templates don't work. That's really my advice. I think we look at our stories and we try to see what templates fit. And I would say your story will work when it breaks the template a little bit. And so, my thing is like, I get a little meta, but I couldn't write my stories without getting a little meta.
Yeah.
And so use the templates as a starting point, but like, don't be afraid to let it break the form. Really, that's the only thing. And also, it sucks. And so if it's going really badly, be discouraged or don't be discouraged. That's up to you.
Yeah.
But don't see that as failing, because it just sucks. It's just like the most unpleasant experience. So that's really it.
That's great. That's great. I think we have, yeah.
We want to be able to open to the audience.
Yes, let's open for questions.
For
Yes.
questions. And we're going
And
to
I
take your mic, and he's going to fix your mic real quick. But we would love to have your questions answered. We'll come and bring the mic to you. If you just want to raise your hand if you've got a question. Anybody? Nobody ever wants to start. Mike is over there. He'll grab the mic, and then I'll come over here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I'm an old school teacher. There is a story at the end of the book. You're looking for the golden eggs. So from the last sentence of the book, I took it, you found them.
Okay.
Is that right? Did I just want to make it a happy ending?
So for those who don't know, the book ends on a cliffhanger.
Yeah. Oh, is that the next book?
It's not the next book, but basically my rule is, a lot of people have asked me in a way that I found surprising. Write me an email.
Okay.
Write me an email.
Okay,
Yeah.
because you just left me with that last sentence. I went, oh no, and so that was a good one.
While you were trying to figure out what your whole history was involving that house and everything around it, did you ever manage to see any of Abraham's family that he had made, either after he left Gertrude, or if any of them came over to the States in any way? Did you ever get to meet any of the family on that side?
Yeah, that part's not really in the book. Basically, Abraham had a wife and a child who died in Auschwitz. And then after the war, he went to Israel, where he had a sister. And so I met the family of the sister, who are all really interesting. Abraham did get remarried to a woman who unfortunately suffered from schizophrenia. So he had a very, very difficult marriage. And then there was another sibling, actually, who went to, he escaped before the war to Argentina. And then he became like this really wild, he had a wild story. He became like a professional boxer and had a relationship with Pinochet, and then became like an international crystal dealer, but like crystal, like a vase, not, just a regular crystal. This is part of the reason we were able to confirm that it was my family. Because when I came to my father initially, I was like, I met there's a whole other side. He's like, it's not true. It's not true. Because like, if there had been cousins, I would have known about it. But then I found out about this crystal vase guy, and he's like, oh yeah, you're right. I remember that guy from my childhood. And I actually had some of his vases. And so I met some of them. I like went to, one guy lives in Florida, one of the children lived in New York. And they were really interesting because they saw Abraham, there was like two Abrahams in a way. There was the Abraham in Poland who's this like weird treasure hunter revered figure. And then there was the Abraham they knew, which was like as like a lovable, eccentric, kind of tragic figure because of his wife, but who never had any more children. And so, but he had died in 79, but like he's sort of being rapidly forgotten. But yeah, so I did meet sort of people who still knew him when he was alive.
Anybody else want to ask a question?
Yeah, and also, feel free, I'm very not defensive, so if your question is weird or critical, you could ask off the page or, you could feel free.
One, thank you for sharing your story with us, but knowing what you know now after you've gone through this whole experience, what might you have done differently
That's good.
looking back?
Learn Polish. That's funny, like, it's hard to say, but one of the things that's sort of a behind the scenes thing here is I was really reluctant to write this book. I was really reluctant to sort of write a book like this at all because I didn't feel, I didn't know my grandfather. And so I felt, in the early stages when I began to sort of just the reclamation stuff, I really didn't want to write about it because I felt I couldn't write it about in a way that felt honest. Mm-hmm. That if I would try to write a story about it, there'd be what I would call a sentimental gravity of being like, that would sort of lean towards a kind of emotional catharsis or some sort of rekindling or sort of reconnecting with my grandfather. And that wouldn't have been true because like, I wasn't sentimental about him, I didn't know him. And like, I didn't know his story. And that doesn't mean he didn't matter to me, but he did matter on an abstract level. And so I was like really reluctant to enter what I would call like the grandchild of survivor genre. Mm-hmm. And so I really resisted that for a long time. And then when the treasure hunters showed up, they made the story so bizarre that I was like, I'm gonna have to at least try. And so the one thing I would like, but that did force me to sort of confront some of the family stuff and to put it in a way that felt honest. So I guess maybe like having a bit more maturity in a way early on of being like, because I kept pushing off. I never even like thought about family story until it was really forced upon me. So maybe sort of preempting that a little bit, but yeah. Really learn Polish. That would be a big one, yeah.
Here we go. We have a question.
I can just talk.
Oh.
So there were treasure hunters at the end of the war who truly dug up graves and tried to get those kind of treasures. Was there ever any discussion among this sort of new generation of treasure hunters about treasure hunters of the past? Was this a familial thing that had, their parents used to do, or were these a whole new generation of treasure hunters?
It's a really, really interesting question. And so just to flesh out, right immediately in the aftermath of the war, there were people who sort of would dig up mass graves searching for anything that had been overlooked. And there's some really, really grim stuff. There's like one of the grimmest economic papers I've ever seen actually did concentric circles around Treblinka in terms of economic post-war activity of like what was found. It's like unbelievably grim. So these guys are on a kind of continuum with those guys, but I would say they're very, very separate. The vast majority of the treasure hunters, especially the serious ones, grew up in the region that they're treasure hunting. And so they actually feel a connection with the history, but it's usually because their fathers were partisans or they fought in some way, but they also know the land. They knew the land as boys. So all of them have these like, honestly, they're probably apocryphal, but they have these like treasure hunter origin stories of like one guy, the guy who owns that site, his story is crazy. His story is like, I was a little boy and my father bought me a horse. And then one day I was riding on the horse bareback. I don't know why it's important that he's bareback. He's like, it was a white horse bareback, and the horse tripped in the snow, and I fell into one of these holes. And you're like, I don't understand anything you're saying. But like the sort of, a lot of them have stories, very romantic boyhood stories, but I think it speaks to something sort of more interesting of like, they have a relationship with the land that is really genuine, which is very unlike my relationship with this history. And so like, my relationship with this history is completely divorced from the land. But I have a special relationship with Poland just because that's where my family was from and where my vast swaths of my extended family were murdered. But we have no geographic knowledge of it. And so these people do, and like that was a different approach to history, which I actually came to really appreciate. I think the treasure hunters, initially when I made them, they're very easy to trivialize because they're very silly and macho, but they're also the caretakers. So like if you, I have come to think of Holocaust scholarship as a map in a way. And so you have the major centers of Holocaust scholarship. You'll have like the Warsaw Ghetto, you'll have Auschwitz. You have these places which have tremendous institutional resources and tremendous amount of scholarship and attention and caretaking. But there's, at the second you go like a little bit further afield, these places are largely ignored. And like, it's very hard to comprehend how many sites there actually are. The United States Holocaust Museum has been counting, and they're still not done. And I think at this point they're at something like 55,000 sites of death, including concentration. So it's such an extraordinary, ghettos, concentration camps, work camps, it's such an extraordinary, it's like an unimaginable number. And the truth is, in these parts, and like, you know, when you're really far afield, there's no museums really, or if there's museums, they don't have resources. You don't see people doing their doctorates on this kind of work. And it's really kind of up to the locals. And in this situation, it is the treasure hunters. And so like, some of them are approaching it for what I would say not the greatest reasons, but they are the only ones who are caring about the sites. And so there's the chapter in my book where I get drunk with the treasure hunters and I get plastered and we have a really good time. The next chapter got cut. The next chapter is they all woke up at 6 a.m. and spent like 18 hours cleaning the site. You know, and so it's like they're doing it for their own strange reasons, but they do care, which I think counts for a lot. And so I think their relationship to history is really sort of complicated. And yeah, it's easy to laugh at. I laughed at them for a while, and I still laugh at them. But like, there's other stuff to sort of consider as well.
Yeah.
What's your favorite color?
What?
What's your favorite color?
My favorite color?
Yes.
You know, it used to be red. It might still be red. I haven't like updated it.
What happened?
I don't know. I don't know.
It's my favorite color.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
This
This has been great, thank you. I wonder if you have any idea why the Germans, who were such fabulous record keepers, why there are no records of this and where they might have been or why they are. Any idea?
You know, we do know that there was a tremendous amount of secrecy about these sites, even during the war. And so we have reports, pretty decent reports, that they would make circles of like boundaries, and anyone who overstepped, even the locals, would be shot on site. It's a little bit of a, you know, the Germans kept great record, but we know that because of the records they kept. So it could point to a lot of things that weren't kept as well. Look, the most likely reason of these tunnels is probably disappointingly banal. It's probably just a factory, almost certainly just a factory or some kind of headquarters. Now, the conspiracy theories are still really fun and interesting, but my favorite one, besides the anti-gravity, is that basically it was all a facade. It was just a way to sort of get money out of Germany. So like the local commanders understood the war was lost, and so they just wanted to get as much money out of Berlin as they could by doing sort of the biggest infrastructure project, the biggest planned infrastructure project at the time. So like Albert Speer, the architect, this is one of the only German sources we have. He mentions these in like a little footnote. So he says about $1 billion was spent, the equivalent to $1 billion today was spent on these in 1944, which is like an extraordinary sort of expense for an army that was losing, and more concrete than was available in all of German occupied Europe. And so like, it was just like huge boondoggle, whatever it was, but no, we don't have like great, it's just very, very scant sources. Yeah, and I don't have any, more to your question, I don't know. Yeah.
This makes sense because German industrial production doubled in 44. So your idea that this is factories, when you think of Nordhausen, where there are factories like this, making the V1 rocket, that fits very well.
Yeah, it's, you know, one of the location isn't an accident because this would be far enough away from the front to avoid being bombed. And so like some sort of combination between factories and headquarters.
Your book has been published in Poland, is that correct?
Yeah, it came out in Poland in May, this past May.
What was the process for that? What did that entail? And then what's the reception been?
You know, the book came out in a whole bunch of countries. The one I cared most about was Poland. For obvious reasons, I felt like and I really tried. And I had great connections. So I got that book in front of very important editors at the big publishing houses, and I could not get a bite. And I gave up, and then this really wonderful, sort of very small nonprofit publisher out of an organization called Carta, which mostly does historical archives, they publish like 2 or 3 translations a year, and they brought it out, and I was really excited, and you know, it was pretty interesting. The question, I went to Poland, I did a little bit of publicity, and the questions I got were so radically different. So I've been doing this, the book came out here in 2021, and I've done many, many events and heard many, many questions, but they're generally pretty similar. The questions I was getting in Poland were utterly different, and really put me on my back foot for the first time. And so because no one cared that much about the tunnels or the treasure hunters. That sort of was easily absorbed. If they knew about it, they probably knew about it. If they didn't know about it, was like not that weird for them. But the notion of Jewish property is just a live wire. And so I had spent like many years sort of actually talking, I feel with American audiences and Jewish audiences, I'm actually in a way representing a Polish perspective, because they're very familiar with the other side. And I let me push back on that and say in Poland, first of all, I knew the least about Polish history in the room. You know, if I talk to a class or I'm talking to a journalist, I know the least. And so I'm put in my place. And second, I found I was actually representing the Jewish perspective, which I was actually very unused to. So really interesting, pretty tense, but almost exclusively about Jewish property. And so the notion of return and rights, that stuff. And I found it very challenging, but really rewarding. Yeah.
So this may be a very personal question as a writer.
Yeah.
But coming from a wannabe writer who has an idea for a memoir that I'm terrified to start fleshing out.
Yeah. And that's, by the way, that's a good start.
Yes, yeah, that's
Yeah.
where I'm at. I've been sitting there for a little while. But how long did it take you personally from the time you typed your first word or wrote your first word until you felt like you were seeing the end, like the light at the end of the tunnel with your book?
You know, it becomes a little bit of a technical, professional question, because I wish there was you just let me go to my little hut and write it. That takes guts, because you're just basically writing it on spec. So I don't have those kind of guts. So just to give a quick overview, in 2017, I wrote a book proposal, and the first what now is basically the first 2 chapters of the book. I sold that right after in 2017. If I hadn't sold that, I don't know if I would have written the book, which is, I don't know. Once you have the back, you're sort of locked in, and it means at least one person is going to read it. So that I began, taking that out of the equation, once I got the book deal at the end of 2017. It's a little tricky because I had to sort of wait for the real world a little bit. When I sold the book, the publishers were like, great, how's the book going to end? Are you going to get the building back? I'm like, of course I'm getting it back. 8 months, tops. So 8 months later, I was like, oh, I'm in a lot of trouble. There's no way I'm getting back this book. So I had to like make something up. And so I was waiting for court decisions. I'm still doing research. But I submitted the manuscript in like 2020. So I would say at least more than 2 years. Yeah, and like, I don't know. Again, it sucks. Yeah, but you should do it. And no, maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not the right person to ask.
Yeah.
Ask your loved ones. Yeah.
Have you done any research to see if the tunnels in Poland had any connection to the tunnels that were in Germany, where they built the atom rockets?
Likely. So like when you see the completed tunnels where they built like some of the V2 and stuff like that, and like in Nora and those very, very large and online tunnels, yeah, I would say there's definitely a connection. But I'm not an expert in tunnels in general. I just sort of know these tunnels, yeah.
Well, the Americans took away their scientists, so, the whole thing
Yeah.
stopped, but perhaps they were planning to move them there.
Likely a weapons factory of some
Right.
sort, yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
In your research, did you visit other sites that were not, so closely related to what you were specifically looking for? And if so, how does Poland remember the Holocaust through those
Great question.
museums or
Yeah.
monuments or so forth?
It's such a big, it's very hard to answer generally because you'll have like the sites in the big cities, which again have like a lot of visitors. They'll have world-class museums. They'll have funding. So you'll have stuff like, the museums in Warsaw, or the ghetto in Krakow, or the big camps. Those have a tremendous amount of sort of memorialization and activity. The sites, once you go far afield, you cannot believe how many there are. And so, and I'm including stuff like Jewish cemeteries. And so the vast majority of them are barely marked, if at all. I think there's sort of we might have an instinct to sort of like blame the locals. I don't necessarily agree with that instinct. On the local level, I'd say a lot of the amazing work is being done by locals. I know people in Benjin who are sort of saving shtiebels, which are like sort of the small synagogues, and they're finding like incredible frescoes, and they're preserving these apartments as like historical monuments. It's pretty, one of the sort of, I would say there's a chapter in the book where I just go around to the camps that Abraham was in, and almost all of them are wiped off the map. I mean, there's just the Gross Rosen network of concentration camps, which is actually where my grandfather was, and so within that network, and so where Abraham was, we don't actually know how many there are. Like we can't even count them. There's somewhere between like 100 and 120. And so but to give sort of a counter example, there was I don't think it's in the book, I don't know, but a really sort of, I would call it responsible historical, one of the treasure hunters, he had spent, I don't know how long, 10 years, 20 years, researching where a camp had been in his town, which had basically been wiped off. And he brought me to it. And he had found sort of like in a barren field, he had found sort of some of the bricks, some of the foundational bricks, which he showed me. And it was just him, like going through archives and interviewing locals. And so it's just like the memorializing the sites is an insurmountable task. And so it's very hard to speak in very broadly. Forget the country, it's very hard to speak about a region or a city or often even a village, just because how much history is actually caked on. And so I'm always really heartened by the people who I know doing amazing work. And there could always be more, but you're like, these are questions which I find really interesting and really challenging. Like, how do you memorialize a site? How do you memorialize a site when there's sort of like a functional town? Like, what is a plaque? Like, it's something, but like, you know, there's a big park in Krakow, sort of right outside the city center, very large central park, which was just a giant camp. But now it's a park, and so some people are weirded out by that. Some people are sort of disturbed, but some people are like, this is what happens. And so I think there's clear-cut cases, like in Vilna, where they put like a sports center on a Jewish cemetery, you know, during the communist times, and you're like, that feels very wrong. And then there's other times you're like, how does the city live? And I find these questions really challenging, but really interesting.
Do you have any sense of what students are learning in schools about Poland and World War II?
Let me offer a disclaimer that I should have offered earlier, is that, you know, I did write a book that takes place in Poland, but my like knowledge of Poland is actually really limited. So I know more than probably most of you guys, but it's really delineated, because like I don't speak Polish, I don't have access to sort of the main channels of culture. I certainly not the scholarship. I can't even watch Polish television. And so like, I do not have my finger on the pulse. I just know, and also the people I meet are really skewed, because like the people, besides the treasure hunters, like, but my friends there are very urban, very educated, very well traveled, and are probably not representative. Whatever it is, it's definitely a skewed sample. And so I'm always very hesitant to sort of make claims on like the larger culture, because I don't know. In my experience, I have found it to be, in my limited experience, to be like one that has gotten better and better. I'm an optimist about the sort of like historical reckonings, and I find in a place, Poland is unbelievably vibrant, and has, this is sort of it's weird to call it an upside, but it is kind of an upside of the visibility of World War II. So I initially spent a lot of time in Lithuania, where it's much more sort of buried. You can't avoid it in Poland. Like, if you're gonna have any reckoning with the space, you're going to see World War II. Auschwitz is the biggest museum in the country. And so like, they are reckoning it on some level. The questions end up becoming like a narrative one. Is it gonna be a Polish nationalist narrative, where like Poles have to reckon with themselves as the sometimes perpetrators or bystanders? Or is it Poles as victims purely? And so that's where you see like the real friction happening.
You can give yourself credit for education, because your book was very educational.
Yes, that's wonderful.
I know the only thing I know is what's in my head, and even that is like barely, yeah.
Is Abraham's book going to be, is that being translated? And
Yeah,
will we get to read
we're
that?
way behind, but it's supposed to be come out from the University of Toronto.
And will
translation.
will you write something in the book?
Yeah, but we're so behind that I wonder if it's going to die, to be honest. But if anyone wants the translation, I could give it to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Since this book came out in a way that I did not anticipate, nor am I like that into, but like such is life, my beat, as you might say, is like Nazi gold that may or may not exist. And so I'm writing a long form magazine or book piece. It's just a crazy story. There's a guy, you know what? It's just a crazy story about gold, about maybe gold.
And what magazine?
It's slated to be in the New York Times Magazine.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to thank everybody for coming. What great questions. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, both of you. I know
Thank you.
I certainly got a whole lot out of it. One of the things as I was listening both to your questions and to the questions from the audience, you talked a lot about fear. One thing that I learned from a Holocaust survivor who just was very emphatic that I never ever let fear win. And I think that that's really important, because if fear would have won, we wouldn't be sitting here today. We wouldn't have this book written. And to all of you who are students, keep pushing forward. You can do this. I know you can. So Menachem, thank you for traveling in with us. We're very excited. We have a teacher workshop tomorrow, and I can't wait to hear all the things that the teachers are going to learn. Carrie, fascinating questions. Thank you so much to both of you.
You're so welcome.
Can we please give them an
Thank
applause?
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would